The night was quiet, save for a sound that did not belong. Across the mist-laden fields, a boy's voice drifted, fragile yet unearthly, carrying words no one could understand. It was not the tune itself that unsettled the villagers, but the language, strange syllables that rolled like echoes from forgotten graves. Farmers returning late from work swore the air turned colder when the song began. Dogs cowered, refusing to follow their masters into the fields, and windows shut quickly as if the shutters alone could keep the sound at bay. Mothers whispered that no child could know such words, unless taught by something far older than men. Fathers muttered of curses, of spirits awakened beneath the soil. Was it a dream, a trick of madness, or a message reaching from beyond memory? Whatever the truth, the boy's song had marked the town forever. At first glance, the village seemed untouched by time. Nestled between rolling fields and a winding river, it was the kind of place where life followed a rhythm as old as the land itself. Farmers rose before dawn, their silhouettes bending low as they tilled the soil, hands roughened by years of labor. Children darted through the lanes, chasing hoops and tossing pebbles, their laughter ringing clear beneath the watchful shadow of the church tower. Each Sunday the bells tolled, calling families into the stone-walled chapel where faith stitched their lives together as firmly as needle and thread. To a stranger, it might have looked like a painting of rural peace, humble, steady, and safe. Yet to those who lived there, safety was an illusion. For all their outward cheer, villagers carried a silence that ran deeper than their roots. Speak too long with them, and you would notice the sudden hush that fell when the boy was mentioned. The smiles would stiffen, eyes would dart, and words would die on their tongues. No one wished to linger on the memory of that sound. The pattern became clear to any who stayed past dusk. As the sun slid behind the hills, shutters creaked closed one by one, as though shielding homes from a darkness no lamp could pierce. Doors were bolted early, long before true night had fallen. Mothers clutched their children close, whispering lullabies that were as much prayers as songs. When the faint singing rose again, thin, drifting, in that strange and mournful tongue, those same mothers pressed trembling fingers to their children's lips, forbidding them to answer, forbidding them even to whisper. It was in these hours, between day's end and the long stretch of night, that the village revealed its hidden face. Streets once busy with wagons and chatter became silent as graveyards. Dogs retreated beneath porches, hackles raised, growls swallowed by fear. Fathers kept watch at the windows, though they never spoke of what they saw or thought they saw, when the boy's voice carried across the fields. And the church, so loud in the daylight, stood dark and unwelcoming, its bells silent as though it too dared not challenge the voice that haunted the night. By morning, life returned, almost as though nothing had happened. Markets reopened, bread baked in the ovens, and laughter filled the lanes once more. But beneath the sunlight, a fragile tension lingered, like cracks beneath fresh paint. The villagers lived in two worlds, one of ordinary days and one of nights when the air itself seemed to listen. And at the heart of it all was a boy whose song refused to be forgotten. The first accounts came quietly, like rumors that refused to die. Farmers were the earliest to notice. They spoke of their cattle breaking into sudden panic when the boy's song drifted across the meadows. Horses reared against their reins, sheep scattered as if chased by unseen wolves, and dogs that once barked boldly now whimpered, tails curled beneath them. It was not just the sound. It was as though the melody stirred something primal, something buried deep in the marrow of beast and man alike. Mothers, too, carried stories. They whispered warnings to their children, never repeat the sounds, never even hum their strange cadence. These are words not meant for the living, they said, pulling little ones close, pressing small faces against their skirts. The children obeyed, though not always willingly. Some claimed to hear whispers woven into the boy's tune, faint and chilling, as if other voices were singing back. The local teacher, a man trained in logic and letters, kept a careful journal. At first he dismissed the unease as peasant superstition, the sort of nervous fancy bred in villages cut off from the world. Yet his tone shifted after weeks of witnessing the silence settle over his students whenever the subject arose. He noted how even the most spirited children refused to describe the songs. One girl fainted outright when asked to hum what she had heard. Another, pale and trembling, insisted that if she repeated the sound, they would come for her. The teacher never pressed again. The stories grew darker, A mother told of her child waking in the night, repeating fragments of the song in a voice that was not her own. The words made no sense, yet carried an intonation too deliberate to be babble. Terrified, she gagged the child with cloth until the voice ceased, swearing she saw lips moving in rhythm to another sound, one only the child could hear. Another family claimed their barn collapsed after a night of singing, though no storm or quake had struck. They insisted the wood had rotted in a single evening, as if consumed by the echoes. With every tale, the villagers built their own rule, a fragile shield against the unknown. The law was simple. When the boy sang, no one answered. No one dared to echo him, mock him, or even speak his name aloud while the sound lingered in the air. Doors were barred, voices stilled, and prayers whispered silently within closed fists. It was less superstition than survival, a pact of silence carved out of fear. And so the village existed between two kinds of time. By day, life stumbled on. Fields tended, bread baked, bells rung. But when dusk descended and the boy's voice rose again, the world held its breath. Fear became ritual, silence became law, and the haunting presence of the song shaped every corner of their lives. It was then that whispers turned to certainty. His words were never meant for human ears. The rules of silence might have endured as whispers, dismissed by outsiders as rural superstition, had it not been for one man, a traveller who scoffed at the fear that gripped the village. He arrived on a damp autumn evening, boots muddied from long roads, laughter quick and mocking. The villagers offered him bread, a place to rest, but also warnings. They urged him not to wander after dusk, not to heed the boy's voice if he heard it. To the traveller it was nonsense, a quaint tale to entertain himself with by firelight. He was a man of the world, he said, not one to be frightened by children's songs. That night clouds smothered the moon. The fields lay drenched in mist, and from somewhere distant the faint song began, thin, wavering, yet carrying with uncanny clarity. Those who heard it from their shuttered homes pressed palms over their mouths and whispered prayers. But the traveller, drunk with ale and arrogance, rose from his cot, declaring he would mock the tune and prove their fears unfounded. With a grin that only widened as villagers begged him to stay, he stepped out into the darkness. By the riverbank he lifted his voice to imitate what he thought was only a child's strange melody. At first his attempt was clumsy, broken by laughter. Then, as if compelled, he grew bolder, stretching the syllables into the cold night air. Some villagers, awake with dread, claimed they heard a change, the boy's song faltering, replaced by something deeper, layered, like echoes answering from within the mist. They said the traveller's name was called that night, not once but many times, woven into the melody. A chorus of unseen voices seemed to rise from the earth and water, soft yet inescapable, wrapping around his song until his voice broke into silence. None dared to look, none dared to follow, for the law was clear: when the boy sang, no one answered. To pursue would be to join him. At dawn the body was found. He lay sprawled upon the damp grass beside the river, eyes wide as if he had witnessed something too vast to comprehend. His mouth hung open, frozen mid-breath, the shape of sound still etched upon his lips. No wound marked his skin, no hand had touched him. Yet the villagers swore his face bore the imprint of the song itself, mouth stretched as though he had tried to cry out against something stronger than his voice. The discovery spread like fire through the town. For years, warnings had circled in half-believed whispers, dismissed by those who wished for reason. But here was proof. Flesh and bone had carried the curse into daylight. The teacher wrote in his journal that no lesson he had ever taught, no scripture he had ever read, seemed sufficient to explain the silence of that corpse. Mothers held their children tighter, fathers barred their doors with greater force, and elders spoke of the law not as superstition, but as commandment. The traveller's fate became the pivot point, the moment fear transformed into ritual. It was no longer a matter of stories or suspicion. The village now had its first martyr to the silence. From that day forward, no one doubted that to answer the boy was to court death. And so the law of the unsung response became sacred, a boundary no villager dared to cross. The echo of the traveller's final broken song lingered long after his body was buried, and the silence that followed grew heavier, darker, binding the town in terror more absolute than ever before. The traveller's death marked the turning point, but it was the generations that followed who carried the burden of that night into law. What began as whispered warnings became codified through ritual, memory, and fear. Elders, clutching diaries written in trembling hands, passed down accounts of the first incident, like sacred scripture. Sermons from the pulpit thundered not of distant sins, but of the curse that dwelled just beyond the village fields. Fireside tales retold the traveller's mocking laughter, his final song, and the silence that swallowed him whole. Children learned early that silence was not merely etiquette, but survival. A dropped word after midnight was treated with the same gravity as a mortal sin. Mothers hushed their infants with trembling hands, rocking them furiously should a cry escape past the 12th chime of the clock. Fathers, grim-faced, drilled obedience with harsh discipline. Punishment for defiance was swift, a stinging switch, a night locked alone in the cold barn or worse, public shaming during Sunday gatherings, where the child's voice was condemned before the entire congregation. Over time, the rule bled into every corner of daily life. The sound of laughter after dark was unthinkable, a transgression that threatened not only the guilty, but the whole family. If one child hummed in the twilight, neighbors would bang upon their shutters, muttering prayers as though a spark had been lit too close to dry hay. In this way, the community policed itself. No man or woman wished to be the weak link that invited ruin. By the second generation, silence was more than law, it was identity. Villagers spoke of themselves as the guardians of quiet, a people set apart by their discipline. Outsiders, traveling scholars or peddlers, noted the oddity, the way children lowered their voices automatically as dusk fell, how streets emptied without a word, how even dogs were trained to still their barking with stern command. It was as though the village breathed by day and held its breath by night. Some diaries describe the transformation with chilling pride. An elder boasted that his grandson, though only 6 years old, knows the cost of sound better than men thrice his age. Another entry tells of a girl beaten until she could no longer speak for days, simply for whispering her brother's name beneath the stars. Silence became inheritance, carved into flesh and memory alike. Yet woven into this discipline was terror that never fully loosened its grip. Parents warned their children not with tales of monsters in the forest, but with the image of the traveler's mouth, frozen open in death. They described how voices in the mist were always listening, waiting for a single response to pull another soul away. Better to swallow your tongue, one mother wrote in her journal, than to let it betray you after midnight. Generations passed, but the law did not soften. If anything, it grew harder, heavier, its roots tangled in every story, every prayer, every household rule. Silence was no longer framed as fear alone, but as virtue, a badge of survival worn by a community that believed it had outlived curses because of obedience. Children grew into adults who did not question the practice, for to question was to tempt fate. And so the boy's song, whether real, remembered, or imagined, continued to shape lives long after its first echo, molding an entire culture where sound itself was the most dangerous weapon of all. It began with whispers in neighboring towns, a tale too strange to ignore, too heavy with superstition to be dismissed outright. Soon it reached the ears of men who lived not by faith, but by curiosity, folklorists who had spent their lives collecting the songs of peasants, the chants of mountain hermits, and the murmured prayers of forgotten shrines. To them, the village was an irresistible specimen, a living relic of myth still pulsing in a modern age. Alongside them came priests, grim-faced and skeptical, yet secretly eager to prove that the devil was never far from where silence reigned. And finally, journalists arrived, hungry for a headline that could sell in coffee houses and cities. Each of them carried notebooks, cameras, and a confidence that this little village could be dissected and explained. At first, their presence unsettled the townsfolk. Women closed shutters tighter, elders muttered at street corners, and children were warned not to speak in front of strangers. The rule, no words after midnight, was not to be joked about. Yet the visitors laughed when they heard it. Our folklorist chuckled that such beliefs belonged to the Dark Ages. One priest raised his hand dramatically, promising to prove that silence was not holy, but fear. And the journalist scribbled eagerly, preparing the headline, "The Village That Feared Its Own Voice." But mockery did not last long. On their second night, they gathered in the village square, waiting to witness what the townsfolk so desperately avoided. Midnight fell like a curtain. The air turned colder, heavier, as though pressing upon their lungs. Then it began, the sound of singing. It was the boy, though none had seen him arrive. His voice seeped from the shadows, melodic yet fractured, each note piercing as if it traveled from beyond the throat. From somewhere deep beneath the earth itself, the folklorists leaned forward, enchanted, whispering frantically into their notebooks. But their words faltered, for the voice multiplied, first one tone, then two, then four, layering into a harmony that no human mouth could sustain. The priests crossed themselves, eyes darting to the villagers who refused to look. The animals tethered nearby grew restless. Dogs howled, horses stamped the dirt. Chickens flapped violently in their coops. The journalist, pale but determined, muttered to himself, "It's only a trick. Only a trick." One scholar, a man named Hartmann, could not resist. His life had been spent chasing the remnants of languages long dead, recording phonetics that most ears dismissed as noise. To him, the boy's song was not terror, it was treasure. He lifted a small recording device, its crank rattling in the tense silence, and captured the unearthly resonance. Then, defying the warnings whispered by trembling villagers, he raised his own voice. At first he hummed, carefully matching the pitch. Then he formed the strange syllables, clumsy and uncertain, but growing clearer with each attempt. The sound wavered through him, twisting his voice into something unrecognizable, as though the language itself refused to be borrowed. His companions urged him to stop, but Hartmann was lost in obsession. Midnight deepened. The boy's melody sharpened. And then, silence. Hartmann was gone. Where he had stood was nothing but his satchel, toppled on the ground. The recording device lay cracked, as though dropped from great height. His notebook was open, its final pages covered in frantic scrawls, symbols and fragments of phonetics, letters bent into shapes no alphabet had ever known. The last line trailed off mid-syllable, ink splattered across the page. As though his hand had been seized mid-stroke, the outsiders searched for him until dawn, combing the fields, knocking on locked doors, even accusing the villagers of foul play. But no trace was ever found. The villagers said little, their eyes downcast, their silence heavier than before. Only one elder spoke, voice like stone. "We told you. No one should sing after midnight." The priests fell quiet, their certainty fractured. The journalists, once eager for spectacle, packed their bags in haste, unwilling to stay another night. And the folklorists, trembling but unable to resist, pored over Hartmann's notebook, running fingers over the jagged phonetics, as though the paper itself hummed. They argued among themselves whether the language belonged to men, angels, or demons. But in the quiet of their rooms, none dared whisper the sounds aloud, for the boy still sang. And the town still listened, breath held, waiting for the night when one more outsider would be foolish enough to join his chorus. In the wake of Hartmann's disappearance, theories began to multiply like weeds. The boy's song was no longer dismissed as superstition. It was dissected, feared, and argued over in hushed tones that carried beyond the borders of the town. Scholars who had once laughed at the villagers now spoke with unease, while priests clung to their crucifixes with a new urgency. Each interpretation, however different, circled the same dreadful conclusion. The boy's voice belonged to no living tongue. Some insisted it was an ancient language, long dead and buried with forgotten tribes. Linguists compared the sounds to fragments of Celtic laments, to the guttural chants of Old Norse sagas, even to lullabies preserved in crumbling manuscripts. Yet nothing matched. The cadence teased recognition, but refused understanding, like a song heard in dreams. One linguist confessed that listening too long brought on dizziness, as though his mind strained to recall something it had never known. Others took the theory further, declaring that the boy's speech did not echo the past of humankind at all, but rather the language of the dead themselves. They said it was the whisper of soil, the resonance of bones, the chorus of those buried in unmarked graves. Some even claimed the sound rose from beneath the ground, threading upward through the boy's mouth like smoke, escaping a cracked tomb. Villagers nodded grimly at this idea, for to them the voice had always seemed doubled, never singular, never merely a child. Priests denounced the language as pure blasphemy. To them it was not simply strange, but sacrilegious, a parody of sacred hymnals, warped into something unholy. They noted that certain phrases twisted like prayers spoken backward, and that the harmonies resembled church choirs split apart, each voice mocking the other. One priest wrote in his journal that the boy was a vessel of corruption, a throat through which hell rehearses its choir. Another claimed that if the singing continued unchecked, it would grow until it consumed not only the village, but the souls beyond it. Yet villagers held their own belief, one more chilling than any scholar or priest dared to voice aloud. They said the boy did not sing alone. They had heard it clearly, a call and a response, as though unseen throats echoed him, mocking him or answering in kind. Some described it as men, others as women, others still as children. One elder whispered that sometimes the responses overlapped, building a chorus too vast to belong to the living. The boy was not the source, they insisted. He was the doorway. The arguments deepened, but so too did the mystery. Was the boy channeling voices long gone, their language kept alive through him? Or was he summoning something that should have remained silent, calling it forth with syllables unfit for mortal mouths? Each theory seemed more dreadful than the last, and none brought peace. Journalists, desperate to frame the story, clashed with one another. Some painted the boy as a prophet, rediscovering the first human tongue. Others branded him a herald of doom, a living omen of death's dominion over the living. Newspapers printed speculative headlines: "The Forgotten Language Found," "The Child Who Sings for the Dead," and "Hymns of the Grave." Each article sold well, but the men who wrote them confessed in private that they felt tainted, as though putting ink to paper had invited the song into their own homes. Even those who tried to ignore the theories found themselves haunted. The patterns lingered in their ears, rhythms like lullabies but warped, unfamiliar, unkind. Mothers in nearby towns swore their infants stirred in their sleep when the boy sang, eyes fluttering, lips moving silently as though they too understood. Shepherds claimed their flocks grew restless, bleating in strange rhythms. At least one family reported hearing the song beneath their floorboards, though the boy was nowhere near. And so the central question remained: was the boy a vessel or a summoner? Was he carrying the voice of the forgotten, or commanding them into the present? Each possibility was unbearable, yet neither could be dismissed. For in every note he uttered, the air grew colder, the silence heavier, the night longer. And those who listened too long swore the language clung to them, like earth beneath their fingernails, like whispers pressed into their skulls. No matter the theory, one truth spread quickly, staining every conversation. The boy's song did not end when he closed his lips. It lingered restless, like the breath of the dead who had at last found a tongue. Decades later, long after the first headlines had faded and the outsiders had moved on, the story of the boy and his haunting song lingered. It remained not in books or newspapers, but in the fragile voices of those who had lived through it, witnesses who had kept their silence for most of their lives until old age loosened their tongues. What they revealed did not lessen the mystery. It deepened it. One woman, a child at the time, recalled the nights when the boy's lullaby floated across the fields. She described how her mother would press her ear against the wooden floor, whispering that the sound was not coming from outside, but rising up from beneath their home. The child grew so afraid of sound itself that even years later, she confessed she could not sleep without stuffing cotton into her ears. Another testimony came from a farmer who claimed to have seen the boy by the river on a night when no one else dared step outside. The boy, he swore, was not alone. Shadows stretched along the water, darker than night, bending and swaying as if listening. When the song ended, the farmer saw the river ripple, though no stone had been thrown. He fled, never speaking of it until near death, when he finally admitted that he had heard his own late father's voice among the chorus. More chilling were the accounts of the infant the child whispered about in hushed fragments. Neighbors admitted that the boy, though always a child in form, sometimes sang in tones that mimicked a baby's cry. Yet this cry, they said, carried the resonance of something too old, too knowing. One neighbor remembered hearing it through thin walls, a sound so pitiful it made her cradle her pillow, as if it were a child. The next morning, she claimed, her real baby bore bruises shaped like fingers, though no one had entered the room. There were stories of doctors, too, men of science who came at the urging of desperate families. One witness swore he saw two physicians approach the boy's dwelling, only to be driven off violently by unseen hands. The torches they carried sputtered out in unison, as though snuffed by breath. One doctor screamed that the very ground had shifted beneath him, and though he survived, he left the town at once, refusing to speak of it again. Among the most disturbing recollections was a man's insistence that he had once seen the boy tied to a bed, hidden away by those who believed restraint could silence him. Yet even bound, the boy sang. His lips never parted, but the melody rose regardless, filling the room until the candles guttered. The man confessed that he fled ashamed, leaving the boy to his strange imprisonment. Years later, his guilt still gnawed at him, for he could not say whether the boy had been a victim or a willing vessel. What united all these voices was not merely fear of the boy, but fear of the silence that followed. Witnesses described the air after each song as unbearable, charged with an absence that seemed alive. Some said it was worse than the singing itself. It pressed on their chests, filled their throats, demanded obedience. This silence became the town's true ruler, shaping its customs, its punishments, its generational law. The elders had always warned against speaking of what they had seen. Breaking silence was considered nearly as dangerous as breaking the midnight law. Yet as death drew near, these witnesses no longer feared the curse of the boy, as much as the weight of their unspoken memories. They poured them into diaries, confessions, and fireside whispers, leaving fragments for future generations to puzzle over. Their testimonies did not agree. Some painted the boy as a vessel of sorrow, cursed to carry the voices of the forgotten. Others saw him as a summoner, delighting in calling forth what should never return. A few believed he was neither, only a mirror reflecting the darkness that already dwelled in every human heart. But all who spoke agreed on one thing. The boy's song never truly left them. Even in old age, even after decades of silence, they swore they could still hear it, faint, distant, waiting. And when their own voices trembled in final confession, it was as if they were not only recalling the past, but joining the chorus themselves, adding their whispers to a song that had never ceased. The years passed, and the village that once pulsed with ordinary life grew hollow. Its farms lay untended, its fields overgrown, its homes shuttered and collapsing under the slow weight of time. Families had fled one after another, carrying with them little more than their fear and their silence. Some left in daylight, wagons creaking under the burden of hurried belongings. Others vanished overnight, leaving dinners half-eaten on tables, candles still burning low. What they abandoned became relics, objects as fragile as their courage, scratched journals hidden in trunks, phonographs left broken with their needles bent, hymnals charred to black fragments as though fire could erase the memory of what they had once. Some travelers who stumbled upon the town in its abandonment found themselves unsettled before they even stepped across its borders. They reported a stillness too deliberate, a quiet that felt like something waiting. Yet that quiet was never complete. As dusk descended and shadows bled into the fields, there came a sound, thin at first, almost mistaken for wind. A faint singing drifted across the meadows, fragile as smoke, yet threaded with an unease that rooted men in place. What unsettled them most was not merely the presence of a voice, but the realization that it no longer belonged to one boy. Listeners swore they heard layers, many voices woven together like strands of rope. Men and women, children and elders, their tones overlapping into something both harmonious and dreadful. Some described it as a choir, but not of the living. The notes stretched too long, held in impossible breaths, curling around the ears like whispers from beneath the soil. One merchant, stopping on his way to another town, claimed the sound pursued him long after he left. He heard it at night while camped miles away, faint but insistent, as though carried not by wind but by memory. He never returned, though he confessed before his death that sometimes he dreamed of joining the chorus himself. Another account came from a priest who traveled with two companions. They entered the village to bless what they thought was a cursed place. By nightfall, one companion swore the voices spoke his name, pulling at his thoughts like hooks. The next morning, his journal contained lines scrawled in a script no one could decipher, letters spiraling into shapes that looked less like language and more like sigils. He disappeared before the journey's end, leaving only those pages behind. Among the ruins, objects bore marks of desperation. Windows nailed shut with iron spikes, doors reinforced with chains, hymnals burned beyond recognition. Yet no barricade had truly held, for the voices had seeped into the soil itself. Travelers whispered that the earth of the field seemed to hum beneath their feet, and that the ruined church bell occasionally swung without touch, tolling low as though answering a hidden choir. As generations passed, the village transformed into a ghost of memory. Maps omitted its name, as though cartographers feared lending it permanence. Yet the legend remained, whispered in roadside inns and among wagon drivers. If you pass the empty fields after midnight, do not stop, do not listen. For the voices that rise from the ground do not simply sing, they call, and those who hear too closely, who let the melody settle inside their chest, may find their own voice gone when dawn arrives, stolen and folded into that endless chorus. The boy had long since vanished, but his song endured. It no longer needed him. The silence of the town had been broken, replaced by something far worse. A choir without end, a sound that belonged to no one and to everyone at once. The village was gone. But the voices were not. Today the village exists only as a memory, etched into stone and silence. Its streets lie broken, cobblestones split by weeds that twist through gaps like veins of the earth, reclaiming what once belonged to it. The houses sag inward, their frames gnawed by weather and time, leaving hollow shells that stand like mourners in an endless vigil. Inside the church, dust lies heavy on the pews, each one lined as if waiting for a congregation that will never return. The altar is cracked, the cross tilted, and the air itself feels weighted, carrying a stillness too complete to be natural. Only the wind disturbs it, whispering through shattered windows like a breath that never belonged to the living. In the graveyard beyond, most of the stones have worn down to illegibility, names and dates erased by rain and moss. Yet one marker remains sharp, its carving preserved as though untouched by time. The stone bears no name, no date, only a single line: "He sang and they answered." It stands alone, a reminder that whatever unfolded here refused to fade entirely into myth. Travelers who stumble upon it leave quickly, some refusing to speak of what they felt when their eyes lingered too long on those words. The story of this place survives in fragments, in journals, in fireside tales, in warnings passed between strangers on darkened roads. Was it nothing more than folklore, a superstition carried by frightened villagers? Was it hysteria born of grief and fear spiraling into legend? Or was it something else, an echo from deep beneath the soil, an ancient voice that found its vessel in the boy and never ceased to call? What remains certain is this: the silence of the village is not empty. It is charged as though holding its breath, waiting. And when the wind threads through the abandoned fields, some swear it carries a note too long, too steady to be human, a voice not entirely gone. The question lingers, pressing against the boundary between story and truth. If one were foolish enough to sing back, just once, would the chorus rise again? The ruins hold their answer, and the silence waits.